Consider for a moment the autumn of 732. Europe stands at a crossroads that will determine the course of Western civilization for the next 1,000 years. The Roman Empire, that magnificent structure of law and order that once stretched from Britannia to Mesopotamia, has been gone for 2 centuries. In its place, chaos. Warlords rule scattered kingdoms. Trade routes lie broken. Cities crumble into ghost towns. And from the south, a new power rises with terrifying speed. The Islamic armies have swept across North Africa and into Iberia in less than a decade. They are unstoppable. Battle-hardened warriors riding swift Arabian horses, united by faith and the promise of conquest. They have crushed the Visigothic kingdom of Spain in a single afternoon at Guadalete. Now they press northward into Francia, into the heart of what will one day become France. Standing against them, Charles Martel, the hammer of the Franks. He faces an impossible strategic problem, one that has plagued every ruler since Rome's legions marched away. How do you defend vast territories when you lack the resources to garrison every border, every mountain pass, every river crossing? The answer that emerges from this crisis will reshape European society for a millennium. But first, there is the battle. Near Tours, between the towns of Poitiers and Tours, Martel assembles his army. They are infantry, mostly. Frankish foot soldiers carrying spears and shields, formed into dense blocks of men. The Islamic cavalry circles them like wolves around a wounded bear. For 7 days they probe the Frankish lines. For 7 days Martel's men hold firm, their shield wall unbreaking. Then the Islamic commander, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, orders the decisive assault. Imagine witnessing this moment. Thousands of mounted warriors thundering across the October fields, their battle cries carried on the autumn wind. The ground trembles beneath their advance. These are not merely soldiers, they are the shock troops of an empire that stretches from the Atlantic to India. Warriors who have conquered half the known world. Against them stand Frankish farmers and townsmen, sweating in their leather armour, gripping their weapons with white knuckles. The cavalry strikes the shield wall like a storm hitting a cliff face. Men are trampled, speared, cut down where they stand. But the Franks do not break. They have been drilled for this. Martel has trained them in the old Roman discipline, the terrible mathematics of infantry cohesion. If every man holds, the line holds. If the line holds, cavalry cannot penetrate. Hour after hour, the battle rages. The Islamic cavalry withdraws, regroups, charges again. Each time they crash against that human wall, and each time it refuses to shatter. Then, in the chaos of combat, word spreads through the Islamic ranks that their camp is being raided. In the confusion perhaps orchestrated by Martel's scouts, perhaps genuine accident, Abdul Rahman rides forward to restore order. A Frankish spear finds him. The commander falls. Without their leader, cohesion dissolves. The Islamic army withdraws under cover of darkness, retreating back toward the Pyrenees. The Franks have won. But Charles Martel understands something profound in the aftermath. He has won this battle, yes. His infantry is held. But it is not enough. You cannot defend Europe with infantry alone. The territories are too vast, the borders too long, the enemies too mobile. Foot soldiers must march to trouble. By the time they arrive, the raid is over, the village is burned, the livestock stolen. What Martel needs is speed. He needs warriors who can move as fast as any raiding force, who can respond to threats before they metastasize into catastrophes. He needs cavalry. Not just any cavalry. The world has known mounted warriors since humans first domesticated horses on the Eurasian steppes 6,000 years ago. But there is a problem with fighting from horseback that has plagued every civilization that attempted it. A horse cannot carry unlimited weight. A man sitting on a horse has no stable platform for delivering powerful blows. When you strike with a lance or swing a sword, the force of your attack pushes you backward. Without something to brace against, you risk tumbling off your mount. For this reason, cavalry has traditionally been used for scouting, raiding, and pursuit, not for direct combat against formed infantry. Then comes the stirrup. It arrives from the east, probably from the steppes of Central Asia, spreading through trade routes and conquest. The stirrup seems simple, a metal loop hanging from the saddle, where a rider places his foot, but its implications are revolutionary. With stirrups, a rider gains stability. He can stand in his saddle, transferring the entire mass of himself and his charging horse into the point of his lance. He becomes not merely a mounted man, but a shock weapon, a human projectile capable of smashing through infantry formations that would have stopped him moments before. The stirrup transforms cavalry from a supporting arm into the dominant military force of the age. But this transformation comes with a price, a profound price. Consider the economics. A war horse costs the equivalent of dozens of oxen. It must be trained for years to remain calm amid the chaos of battle. A suit of armor chainmail covering the body, an iron helmet, a shield, a lance, a sword, requires hundreds of hours of skilled craftsmanship. Then there is the training. A knight must practice constantly, must remain physically fit, must maintain his weapons and his mount. He cannot also plough fields or tend sheep. He is a full-time warrior. The mathematics become stark. One properly equipped knight requires the agricultural surplus of approximately 40 peasant families to sustain him. 40 families farming, producing grain and livestock, paying taxes and rents, all to support one man who produces nothing but security. And one knight is not enough. You need dozens, hundreds, to defend a kingdom. This is the equation that births feudalism. Charles Martel sees the solution with brilliant clarity. He needs cavalry. Cavalry requires enormous wealth. Where does that wealth exist in 8th century Europe? In the church. The church, you must understand, is by far the richest institution in Christendom. Centuries of donations have filled its coffers with land, villages, entire estates. The church's holdings are vast, often better managed than secular properties, and critically, church lands pay no military service. Monks pray, they do not fight. Martel makes a decision that scandals Christendom. He seizes church lands. Not all of them, he is no fool seeking excommunication, but enough. He redistributes these estates to his warriors, with one clear stipulation. In exchange for the land, they must serve him as mounted warriors. They must equip themselves as cavalry, maintain their readiness, and answer his call to battle. This is the birth of the feudal contract, land for service. The deal is straightforward, almost brutal in its simplicity. A lord grants a fief and estate to a vassal. The vassal swears loyalty and promises military service. The estate provides income from peasant farmers who work the land. That income supports the vassal's equipment, training, and household. When the lord calls, the vassal rides to war. The system works because it solves the resource problem. Kings no longer need to collect taxes from every village, store that wealth, and then distribute it to soldiers. Instead, they decentralize the economic model. Each warrior maintains himself from his own estate. The land itself becomes the payment system. But there is genius here, beyond mere economics. Consider what Martel has created, a distributed military network. Unlike Roman legions that required supply trains and central coordination, these mounted warriors live dispersed across the landscape. Each one is a node in a defensive grid. When trouble emerges, a Viking raid on the coast, a Magyar incursion from the east, a border skirmish with a neighbouring kingdom, the nearest knights respond immediately. They do not wait for orders from a distant capital. They defend their own lands because those lands are their livelihood. The system creates perfect incentive alignment. A knight's wealth depends on his territory remaining productive. Peasants cannot farm if villages burn. Harvests cannot be collected if raiders steal them. Therefore, knights defend ferociously, not from abstract loyalty to a distant king, but from immediate self-interest. Of course, the Church objects. Bitterly. Martel has stolen consecrated lands, they cry. He has committed sacrilege. But Martel's heir, his grandson Charlemagne, will resolve this moral complexity with typical medieval ingenuity. He conquers half of Europe and forces the Pope to crown him Holy Roman Emperor. In exchange, he guarantees church protection and expands church influence into newly conquered pagan territories. The quid pro quo is clear. The church accepts the new order, and the new order sanctifies the church's authority. By the early 9th century, the system has crystallized. Europe is reorganized around cavalry. At the top sit kings, who control the largest territories. Below them, dukes and counts hold vast fiefs in exchange for providing military forces. Below them, knights hold smaller estates, each supporting one mounted warrior. At the bottom, peasants later called serfs work the land, tied to the soil, providing the agricultural surplus that makes the entire structure function. It is not egalitarian. It is not fair by any modern standard. But it works. After centuries of chaos following Rome's collapse, Europe has found a new organizing principle. A way to defend itself. A way to maintain order without the massive bureaucracy that Rome required. And the cavalry that emerges from this system proves devastatingly effective. In 955, at the Battle of Lechfeld, German knights under Otto the Great annihilate a Magyar raiding force, ending decades of Hungarian invasions into Western Europe. The Magyars, themselves skilled horsemen, cannot withstand the charge of armoured knights. The stirrup has made the difference. These are not skirmishers shooting arrows from horseback. These are human battering rams, unstoppable in the charge. Yet even as the system succeeds, it shapes society in ways that will echo for 1,000 years. Military necessity has created a hereditary warrior class. Knights pass their estates to their sons, who train from childhood in the arts of war. By age 7, a noble boy leaves his mother's household to serve as a page in another lord's castle. He learns to ride, to fight, to endure hardship. By 14, he becomes a squire, serving a knight directly, maintaining weapons and armour, practicing constantly. If he proves worthy, he receives knighthood in his early 20s through an elaborate ceremony that mixes military oath-taking with religious sacrament. This is not merely job training, it is the creation of a culture, a value system, an identity. Knights begin to see themselves as different from common people, special, chosen. They develop codes of behaviour, courage in battle, loyalty to one's lord, protection of the weak, honour above mere survival. These ideals will eventually be romanticised into the concept of chivalry, though the reality on medieval battlefields is often far bloodier and more pragmatic than the legends suggest. But something remarkable has occurred. In solving a tactical problem, how to defend territory with mobile warriors, European society has invented a new form of social organisation. Feudalism is not merely an economic system or a military structure. It is a complete reimagining of how power, wealth, and obligation flow through society. Every person has a place. Every place has obligations. From the highest king to the lowest serf, everyone is bound in a web of mutual dependency. The knight stands at the centre of this web. He is the lord's muscle, the peasant's protector, the church's sword arm. He is expensive, dangerous, essential, and for roughly 600 years, he will dominate the European battlefield as completely as the Roman legion once did. This is how civilizations adapt to changed circumstances, not through grand philosophical debates or democratic votes, but through pragmatic solutions to immediate problems. Charles Martel needed to stop Islamic expansion. The stirrup gave him a tool. Economic necessity created a system to deploy that tool. And once created, that system took on a life of its own, shaping law, culture, religion, and politics across an entire continent. The cavalry solution, born from crisis, becomes the foundation of medieval Europe. From this foundation, everything else will follow: castles and crusades, tournaments and betrayals, glorious victories and catastrophic defeats. But first, there must be knights. And now there are. There is a ceremony taking place in a great hall somewhere in 11th century France. A man kneels before another man. He places his hands between the hands of the one seated above him. He speaks an oath. "I become your man." The Lord replies, "I receive you and take you as my man." They kiss. Witnesses watch. Priests murmur blessings. Land changes ownership without a single coin exchanging hands. This is the homage ceremony, and it is one of the most elegant solutions to the problem of power ever devised. Consider what is happening here. The kneeling man is not a slave being purchased. He is not a servant being hired. He is entering into a contract, though that word does not quite capture the depth of what occurs. He is binding himself through sacred oath, witnessed by God and community, to serve another man. In exchange, he receives land, income, protection, and status. But the bond flows both ways. The Lord also swears obligations. He must protect his vassal, defend his interests, provide justice. If the Lord fails in these duties, the vassal can, in theory, withdraw his service. This mutuality is revolutionary. In most hierarchical systems throughout history, power flows only downward. Kings command, subjects obey, masters own, slaves serve. But feudalism creates something more complex, a network of reciprocal obligations where even the powerful are bound by their promises. Of course, theory and practice often diverge in medieval Europe. A powerful lord can abuse a weak vassal with relative impunity, but the ideal matters. The ceremony matters because it establishes a principle that will echo through European legal thought for centuries. Governance requires consent, even if that consent is heavily constrained by circumstances. Let us examine how this system functions in practice. At the apex sits the king. In theory, he owns all land in the kingdom. In practice, he controls only what he can personally manage: his royal domain, perhaps a few key cities, strategic castles. The rest he distributes to his greatest vassals, dukes, counts, margraves. These magnates control entire regions, sometimes territories larger than many independent kingdoms. These great lords, in turn, subdivide their holdings. They grant fiefs to lesser nobles, barons, and knights who swear fealty to them, and these knights might further subgrant portions of their lands to other warriors. A single estate might have layers of obligation stacked upon it like geological strata. The peasant farmer working the field owes service to the knight who holds the village. That knight owes service to the baron who granted him the fief. The baron owes service to the count to the duke to the king. It resembles a pyramid, but it functions more like a web. Because here is the complication that makes feudalism brilliantly adaptive and maddeningly chaotic. A vassal can hold fiefs from multiple lords. A knight might own one estate from the Count of Anjou and another from the Duke of Normandy. To whom does he owe primary loyalty when Anjou and Normandy go to war against each other? Medieval lawyers develop elaborate theories to resolve such conflicts. They create the concept of liege homage, a primary oath that supersedes others. They establish protocols for how a vassal caught between competing lords should behave. Sometimes these protocols work, often they do not. The result is a political landscape of extraordinary complexity, where allegiances shift like sand and civil wars erupt with depressing regularity. Yet for all this chaos, the system provides something crucial: distributed power. Unlike the centralized Roman bureaucracy or later absolute monarchies, feudal Europe has no single point of failure. If a king is weak, strong dukes maintain order in their regions. If a duke proves tyrannical, his vassals can appeal to the king or rebel with some legal justification. Power is fractured, contested, negotiated constantly. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Norman conquest of England. The year is 1066. William, Duke of Normandy, lands on the English coast with approximately 7,000 men, perhaps 5,000 of them mounted warriors. He faces a kingdom of roughly 2 million people. The odds appear impossible. How does one control a hostile population 400 times larger than one's army? William's genius lies in applying feudal organization with methodical precision. After defeating King Harold at Hastings, a victory won largely by Norman cavalry breaking the English shield wall, William does not attempt to garrison every town with his limited forces. Instead, he implements the feudal contract across the entire kingdom. He strips land from the Anglo-Saxon nobility who opposed him. These confiscated estates, easily 90% of England's arable land, he redistributes to his Norman followers. But the grants come with explicit conditions. Each Norman lord must build a castle to control his territory. He must provide a specified number of knights for royal service. 50 knights for a major barony, perhaps 10 for a minor one. He must swear unambiguous homage to William alone. William is creating a loyalty network built on self-interest. His Norman lords are foreigners in a hostile land. They have no local connections, no traditional claims to legitimacy. Their only security comes from the feudal system William imposes. If William falls, they fall. Therefore, they support him absolutely. Meanwhile, William positions castles with strategic brilliance. These are not merely military strongpoints, they are nodes of control in a network of domination. A castle at a river crossing controls trade. A castle on a height overlooks the surrounding countryside. From perhaps 500 castles scattered across England, a few thousand Norman knights can monitor, intimidate, and suppress a population of millions. The English peasantry quickly learns a harsh lesson. Resistance is futile. When a village rebels, knights ride out from the nearest castle and burn it. The rebellion ends. Other villages see the smoke and reconsider their options. Within a generation, Norman rule becomes accepted reality. The feudal system has transformed conquest into stable governance. But William faces opposition from an unexpected quarter: the Church. The Church, you must understand, has its own hierarchy, its own sources of authority that predate feudalism. Bishops and abbots control vast estates, administer justice, and command loyalty from thousands of clergy. They answer to the Pope in Rome, not to local kings. This creates tension. Who truly rules Christian Europe, the kings with their knights, or the Pope with his priests? The conflict produces one of feudalism's most fascinating innovations, the Peace and Truce of God movement. It begins in the late 10th century as church councils decree that certain people are off limits for violence: clergy, monks, merchants, farmers, women, children. These are non-combatants who must not be harmed even during warfare. Furthermore, certain times are prohibited for fighting: Sundays, holy feast days, Lent, Advent. Violence must observe a schedule. Knights initially ignore these restrictions, but the Church wields powerful weapons: excommunication, interdict, the threat of eternal damnation. More practically, the Church can refuse burial in consecrated ground, deny last rites, turn local populations against a lord who violates church peace. These threats matter in a deeply religious age where people genuinely fear hell. Gradually, the peace and truce of God becomes integrated into feudal culture. Knights swear oaths not merely to their lords but before God to protect the weak and honor the Church's restrictions. This Christianization of knighthood serves the Church's interests. It gains moral authority over violence itself, but it also benefits secular rulers. A knight who believes God watches his conduct is more predictable, more controllable than one who acts purely from self-interest. The Church's influence extends further through the knighting ceremony itself. What begins as a purely military ritual, a lord striking his new warrior with his sword in acknowledgement of martial readiness, becomes a religious sacrament. By the 12th century, a knight spends the night before his investiture in prayer. He bathes to symbolize purification. He wears white as a sign of spiritual commitment. A priest blesses his sword. He swears to defend the Church, protect widows and orphans, uphold justice. Is this mere propaganda? Certainly, many knights honor these oaths in the breach. Medieval chronicles overflow with accounts of knights pillaging churches, burning villages, assaulting travelers. Yet the ideal shapes behavior more than cynics acknowledge. When a knight violates the code too flagrantly, he loses status among his peers. When he upholds it, he gains honor, a currency as valuable in medieval society as gold. The feudal contract, then, is not merely between lord and vassal. It is triangulated: lord, vassal, and church. Each party constrains the others. The lord provides land and protection. The vassal provides military service. The Church provides legitimacy and moral framework. Remove any leg of this tripod and the structure collapses. This becomes evident in the relationship between castles and territory. A castle is more than a fortification. It is a physical manifestation of feudal power. Imagine standing before a Norman motte and bailey castle in the 11th century. Before you rises an artificial hill, the motte perhaps 50 feet high, surrounded by a deep ditch. Atop this mound sits a wooden tower commanding views for miles. At its base spreads the bailey, an enclosed courtyard containing barracks, stables, workshops, and a chapel. Wooden palisades encircle everything. Later centuries will replace wood with stone, but the principle remains: concentrated defensible power, projecting control over surrounding territory. The mathematics of castle warfare favor the defender overwhelmingly. A garrison of 20 men can hold a well-supplied castle against hundreds of attackers. Besieging a castle requires enormous resources: men to surround it, supplies to feed those men, and time to starve out the defenders. Most medieval armies, composed of feudal levies who must return home for harvest, cannot sustain sieges longer than a few weeks. The castle endures. Therefore, castles serve as anchors for territorial control. A lord who holds a castle controls the surrounding region. Even if an enemy army marches through, the castle remains, a thorn that cannot be extracted without prohibitive cost. This is why castle positioning matters so profoundly. Place castles at strategic intervals across a territory, and you create an interlocking network of mutually supporting strong points. Any invasion must either bypass these fortresses, leaving hostile forces in its rear, or reduce them one by one, a process that can consume years. William the Conqueror understands this perfectly. His castle network transforms England into a Norman possession, not through battle but through architecture. Each castle represents a permanent Norman presence, a statement that the conquest is irreversible. Yet castles create their own problems. A castle makes its holder dangerously independent. A baron in his stronghold can defy even his king with relative impunity. This tension between royal authority and baronial autonomy defines much of medieval politics. Kings constantly struggle to prevent their most powerful vassals from becoming too powerful, while those vassals constantly push against royal restrictions. The solution is never permanent. It requires constant negotiation, occasional violence, strategic marriages, careful distribution of honors and offices. Medieval governance is intensely personal. A king must know his vassals, understand their ambitions, assess their loyalty. He must reward the faithful, punish the treacherous, and most delicately manage those who hover between the two extremes. This personal quality of feudal governance makes it both flexible and fragile. Flexible because a wise king can adapt to changing circumstances, can forge new alliances, can promote capable men regardless of birth. Fragile because everything depends on individual relationships. A bad king can destabilize an entire realm. A succession crisis can trigger civil war. Consider the anarchy, the period from 1135 to 1154 when England descends into civil war following Henry I's death. His designated heir is his daughter Matilda, but many barons refuse to accept a female ruler. They support Stephen of Blois instead. For 19 years, the kingdom tears itself apart as two claimants battle for the throne, castles change hands. Repeatedly, armies ravage the countryside. The chroniclers describe it as a time when Christ and his saints slept. The anarchy reveals feudalism's inherent instability. Without clear succession, without a universally accepted ruler, the feudal pyramid fractures into warring factions. Yet it also demonstrates the system's resilience. Even during civil war, local feudal relationships often hold. A knight remains loyal to his immediate lord even as that lord switches sides in the larger conflict. The basic unit of feudal organization, the bond between vassal and lord, survives national catastrophe. Eventually, a compromise emerges. Stephen remains king for his lifetime, but Matilda's son Henry will succeed him. This is feudal problem-solving in action, personal negotiation, acceptance of reality, pragmatic compromise. When Stephen dies in 1154, Henry II ascends peacefully. Order returns. Henry, incidentally, rules not merely England but also Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine territories, acquired through inheritance and marriage. His Angevin empire stretches from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Yet he rules each territory through its own feudal structure, granting and receiving homage, and negotiating with local barons. There is no unified administration, no common legal code. There is only Henry's personal authority, exercised through the feudal contracts binding him to hundreds of vassals. This is feudalism at its apex, a system that can organize vast territories without the bureaucratic machinery of Rome or the centralized power of later absolute monarchies. It works because it aligns individual self-interest with collective security. The knight protects his fief because it feeds him. The baron supports his king because the king legitimizes his power. The church sanctifies the whole arrangement because it gains protection and influence. It is not efficient, it is not rational by modern standards, but it functions. For roughly 4 centuries, from the 9th to the 13th, feudalism provides the organizational framework for European society. It shapes law, culture, warfare, religion. It creates the knightly class whose deeds fill medieval chronicles and whose ideals inspire Renaissance poetry. Yet even as feudalism reaches its height, forces are gathering that will eventually undermine it. Trade is reviving, towns are growing, money is replacing land as the primary form of wealth. But that transformation lies ahead. For now, in the 12th century, the feudal contract remains the foundation of European power. A man kneels. He places his hands between another man's hands. He swears. Loyalty, land and obligation flow through this gesture. From this seemingly simple act, kingdoms rise and fall. This is the feudal contract: power through obligation, order through mutual dependence, stability through a web of sacred oaths. And from this web, armoured knights ride forth to their greatest adventure, the Crusades. On a November day in 1095, in an open field outside the city of Clermont in central France, Pope Urban II delivers a speech that will change the course of history. Thousands gather to hear him, bishops and abbots in their ecclesiastical robes, nobles on horseback, common pilgrims standing in the mud. The Pope speaks of Jerusalem, the holy city where Christ walked, now held by Muslims. He speaks of Christian pilgrims harassed and killed. He speaks of the Byzantine emperor's desperate plea for help against Turkish invasions. And then he makes an offer that catches like wildfire in the minds of his listeners. "Take up the cross," he says. "March to Jerusalem, free the holy sepulchre from the infidel, and God will forgive all your sins. Complete remission of sins, instant salvation, no purgatory, no penance, direct passage to heaven when you die. It is the most valuable currency the Church can offer, and Urban spends it freely." But he adds something else, something he mentions almost as an afterthought: the wealth of the East, the silks and spices, the gold and grain, the rich cities waiting to be conquered. This is the greatest pitch in medieval history. Spiritual salvation and material wealth combined, the eternal and the immediate, heaven and gold, and tens of thousands of Europeans respond. The First Crusade is, in essence, the most successful startup venture of the Middle Ages. Consider the investment model. Participants must liquidate assets to fund their journey, sell lands, mortgage properties, borrow from Jewish moneylenders or wealthy abbeys. The costs are staggering. A knight needs not only his own equipment but supplies for months of travel, pack animals, provisions, money for passage through hostile territories. Estimates suggest a knight might spend the equivalent of 4 to 5 times his annual income to join the crusade. The risk is total. Most crusaders never return. They die of disease, starvation, battle wounds, or sheer exhaustion on the 1,000-mile march to Jerusalem. Those who survive face uncertain prospects in a strange land far from home. But the potential return justifies the risk. For younger sons, and this is crucial, the crusade represents their only path to wealth and status. Understand the predicament of the second son in a feudal family. Primogeniture, the practice of the eldest son inheriting everything, has become standard across much of Europe by the 11th century. It solves a problem preventing estates from being divided into ever smaller fragments but creates another. What happens to the younger sons? They receive nothing, or perhaps a small stipend, a minor position in the church, a token estate, insufficient to support a knightly household. These younger sons are trained as knights. They know no trade but war. Their entire upbringing prepares them for a lifestyle they cannot afford. They are dangerous, armed, skilled, frustrated men with nothing to lose. Many become mercenaries or bandits. Some enter tournaments, fighting for prizes and ransoms. But the crusade offers something better, a chance to carve out kingdoms in the East, to become lords in their own right through conquest. So they go. They sell everything, borrow more, and march toward Jerusalem with dreams of Eastern estates and sacred glory. The journey itself nearly destroys them. The Crusader armies for multiple forces depart from different regions, must cross the breadth of Europe, traverse Anatolia, siege hostile cities. They lack maps, proper logistics, any coherent supply chain. In Anatolia, crossing the arid plateau in summer, thousands die of thirst and heat exhaustion. At the siege of Antioch, disease and starvation kill more crusaders than combat. By the time the various armies converge on Jerusalem in June of 1099, their numbers have been reduced from perhaps 60,000 to perhaps 15,000 effective fighters. But they have reached Jerusalem, and on July the 15th, 1099, after a brutal month-long siege, they breach the walls. What follows is one of the most horrific massacres in medieval history. The Crusaders, half mad with religious fervour, exhaustion, and pent-up violence, slaughter the city's inhabitants with systematic brutality. Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians who are indistinguishable from the Muslims in appearance, all are killed. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilas, himself a participant, writes that crusaders rode through streets where blood reached to their horses' knees. Another account claims that in the Temple Mount area, the blood was ankle-deep. Modern historians debate these numbers. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerate. But even allowing for hyperbole, the massacre is devastating. Thousands die. The survivors flee or are enslaved. Jerusalem, empty of its inhabitants, is repopulated with crusaders and later with Christian settlers from Europe. The violence reveals something essential about the Crusades. These are not purely spiritual ventures. They are invasions, conquests, exercises in raw power. The religious rhetoric provides justification and motivation, but the underlying logic is territorial acquisition and wealth extraction. The Crusaders do not merely visit Jerusalem as pilgrims, they seize it, establish kingdoms, and distribute land among themselves like any conquering army. 4 Crusader states emerge from this conquest: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Collectively, they control a narrow strip of the Levantine coast, perhaps 150 miles at its widest extent. Surrounded by hostile Muslim territories, vastly outnumbered, these kingdoms should not survive. Yet they endure for nearly 2 centuries. How? Through a combination of military innovation, strategic brilliance, ruthless pragmatism, and extraordinary good fortune. First, the military innovation. The Crusader states cannot match Muslim numbers, so they maximize the effectiveness of their heavy cavalry. They build castles at every strategic point, controlling mountain passes, guarding water sources, anchoring defensive lines. These are not European-style castles, but massive fortifications adapted to Middle Eastern conditions. Crac des Chevaliers, the greatest of these strongholds, has walls 40 feet thick in places, can garrison 2,000 men, and contains enough cisterns and granaries to withstand a 5-year siege. From these castles, small forces of knights can control vast territories. 100 knights can raid or defend along hundreds of miles of frontier. When Muslim armies invade, the Crusaders retreat to their fortifications and wait. Medieval armies, relying on seasonal levies and limited supplies, cannot sustain long sieges. Eventually, they withdraw. The castles remain. Second, the strategic brilliance. The Crusader states exploit divisions among their Muslim neighbors. Fatimid Egypt fights with Seljuk Syria. Turkish warlords battle each other for territory. The Crusaders form alliances with one Muslim power against another, switching sides as circumstances dictate. They are shameless about this pragmatism. Christian rhetoric notwithstanding, they will ally with Muslims against other Christians if the strategic calculus favors it. Third, the ruthlessness. The Crusader states practice total war against enemies and strict control over subject populations. Muslims and Jews living under Christian rule face heavy taxation and second-class legal status. Any rebellion is crushed immediately. The message is clear: accept Christian dominance or face annihilation. Fourth, the good fortune. For several decades, the Muslim world remains divided. Not until Zengi, and later his son Nur ad-Din, and finally Saladin unify Muslim resistance does the strategic situation truly deteriorate for the Crusaders. This disunity gives the Crusader states breathing room to establish themselves, to build their fortifications, to develop sustainable governance. But the real innovation of the Crusades is not military, it is financial. The Crusades create Europe's first international corporations, the military orders. Consider the Knights Templar, founded around 1120 to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. The Templars quickly evolve into something far more significant. They are warrior monks, combining military prowess with monastic discipline. They swear vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They wear white mantles emblazoned with red crosses. They are elite fighters, renowned for refusing to retreat or surrender, but their genius lies in their organizational structure. The Templars answer only to the Pope, not to any king or bishop. This makes them effectively sovereign. They establish commanderies across Europe and the Holy Land, fortified compounds that serve as military bases, administrative centers, and financial hubs. They receive donations of land and money from grateful nobles. They accumulate vast wealth, and then they innovate. They create an early form of banking. A pilgrim in Paris can deposit money with the Templars, receive a coded receipt, and withdraw equivalent funds in Jerusalem. This allows safe transfer of wealth across dangerous distances without carrying actual gold. The Templars charge a modest fee for this service. Over time, they begin lending money to kings and nobles, charging interest through carefully structured arrangements that technically avoid church prohibitions on usury. By the 13th century, the Knights Templar managed the finances of several European kingdoms. They are bankers, warriors, diplomats, and landholders. They are wealthier than most nations, and they are completely autonomous, a state within states, bound only by their oaths to the Pope. The Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John, follow a similar trajectory, though they begin as a medical order caring for sick pilgrims. They, too, become militarized, build castles, accumulate wealth, and establish an international network. The Teutonic Knights, founded later, carve out their own state in Prussia through crusading conquest of pagan Baltic peoples. These military orders represent a profound evolution of feudalism. Traditional feudal bonds are personal and territorial. A knight swears loyalty to his lord in exchange for a specific fief, but the military orders transcend this local structure. They are international organizations with standardized training, unified command, and professional administration. A Templar knight in Spain follows the same rule, wears the same uniform, and obeys the same Grand Master as a Templar in Syria. This is not feudalism. It is something closer to modern corporate structure. The military orders have hierarchical management, specialized divisions, standardized procedures, and centralized strategic planning. They are incredibly effective, both militarily and economically. Their wealth transforms the Crusader states. The military orders can afford to maintain permanent garrisons, build massive fortifications, and field armies when secular nobles lack resources. During the 12th century, perhaps 1/3 of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military strength comes from the military orders. They are the backbone of Crusader defense. But the Crusades' greatest economic impact occurs back in Europe through control of Mediterranean trade. Before the Crusades, Italian merchants, particularly from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, trade with the Islamic world but on disadvantageous terms. Muslim middlemen control access to Asian goods, spices from India and Indonesia, silk from China, precious stones, perfumes, dyes. Europeans pay premium prices for these luxuries. The Crusades changed the equation. Italian city-states provide ships to transport crusaders and supplies to the Holy Land. In exchange, they receive trading concessions in captured cities, entire quarters of ports like Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa. From these bases, Italian merchants trade directly with Asian caravans, bypassing Muslim middlemen. Profits skyrocket. Venice, in particular, exploits the Crusades brilliantly. The Venetians care little for religious ideology. They are merchants first. They trade with Muslims when profitable. They transport crusaders when paid. During the Fourth Crusade, when the crusaders cannot pay their passage, Venice essentially hijacks the entire crusade, redirecting it to attack Venice's commercial rivals, ultimately sacking Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, in 1204. The sack of Constantinople is the Crusades' ultimate betrayal of stated ideals. Crusaders who swore oaths to defend Christianity slaughter Orthodox Christians, loot churches, steal relics, and burn libraries. They do this not from religious conviction but for Venetian gold. The Fourth Crusade never reaches the Holy Land. It simply enriches Venice and fragments the Byzantine Empire, weakening Christianity's eastern bulwark against Islam. Yet even this catastrophe enriches Europe. The looted wealth of Constantinople flows west: art, manuscripts, relics, gold. The knowledge preserved in Byzantine libraries begins reaching Western Europe, contributing to the later Renaissance. And Venice's trading empire expands dramatically, controlling ports throughout the eastern Mediterranean. For roughly a century, the Crusades are extraordinarily profitable for those positioned to benefit. Italian merchants become fabulously wealthy. The military orders accumulate vast estates. Younger sons who gamble on eastern ventures establish baronies and counties. The Church's prestige soars from leading this great Christian enterprise. But the fundamental strategic problem never gets solved. The Crusader states are tiny, isolated, surrounded by populations that outnumber them 50 or 100 to 1. They depend on a constant flow of reinforcements from Europe. When that flow diminishes, when European enthusiasm for crusading wanes, the Crusader states become indefensible. The turning point comes with Saladin, a Kurdish general who unifies Egypt and Syria under his rule. Saladin represents everything the Crusaders feared: Muslim unity. In 1187, Saladin destroys the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army at the Battle of Hattin. Through strategic brilliance, he lures the Crusaders into waterless terrain during summer. The Christian army, dying of thirst, is annihilated. Saladin captures King Guy of Jerusalem, executes the military order knights as irreconcilable enemies, and then marches on Jerusalem itself. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrenders. 88 years after the First Crusade captured it, the Holy City returns to Muslim control. Saladin, to his credit, does not massacre the inhabitants. He demands ransom for Christian residents and allows those who can pay to depart safely. It is a stark contrast to the Crusaders' behavior in 1099. Europe responds with the Third Crusade, bringing together the greatest kings of the age: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. It is a massive, expensive, ultimately futile effort. Frederick drowns, crossing a river before even reaching the Holy Land. Philip returns home after minor successes. Richard achieves military victories, recaptures some coastal cities, but cannot retake Jerusalem. In 1192, he negotiates a truce with Saladin, leaves the east, and never returns. Subsequent crusades achieve progressively less. The Fifth Crusade invades Egypt, gets bogged down in the Nile Delta, and surrenders. The Sixth Crusade, led by Emperor Frederick II, regains Jerusalem through negotiation, rather than battle a diplomatic success that scandalized crusaders who wanted holy war, not treaties. Jerusalem is lost again 15 years later. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades, led by the pious King Louis IX of France, end in disaster. Louis dies of disease in Tunisia, and the crusading movement effectively dies with him. By 1291, when Acre, the last Crusader stronghold, falls to the Mamluk Sultan, the Crusader states are extinct. 2 centuries of effort, hundreds of thousands of lives, unimaginable expenditure of wealth, all for kingdoms that ultimately failed. Why? The answer is brutally simple: overextension and unsustainable logistics. The Crusader states are too far from their base of support, too surrounded by enemies, too dependent on constant reinforcement from a Europe that increasingly has other concerns. The economic incentives that drove the First Crusade plunder, new territories, trading opportunities diminish as the easy conquests end and the costs of defending shrinking territories escalate. The military orders survive the fall of the Crusader states. The Hospitallers relocate to Rhodes, then Malta, becoming a naval power. The Teutonic Knights pivot to conquering Prussia and the Baltic. The Templars, lacking territory to defend, focus on banking and become so wealthy and powerful that King Philip IV of France destroys them in the early 1400s, arresting all Templars in France on fabricated charges of heresy, torturing confessions from their leaders, and burning the Grand Master at the stake. Philip's true motive is transparent. He owes the Templars enormous debts that he erases by destroying the order. What, then, is the legacy of the Crusades? Militarily, they demonstrate both the power and limitations of heavy cavalry in extended campaigns far from home. Economically, they accelerate the development of banking, international trade networks, and corporate organizational structures. Politically, they strengthen papal authority for a time by demonstrating the Church's ability to mobilize all Christendom. Culturally, they intensify Christian-Muslim hostility that echoes into the modern era. But perhaps most significantly, the Crusades represent feudalism's greatest gamble. The system designed to defend European territories through distributed cavalry power is projected across continents in an attempt to conquer and hold distant lands. For a century, against all odds, it works. The high-risk venture pays extraordinary returns, but eventually, reality imposes its constraints. Distance matters. Logistics matter. Population ratios matter. No amount of courage, faith, or military skill can permanently overcome strategic impossibility. The Crusaders who survived, who returned to Europe with Eastern wealth and fantastic stories, did transform their homeland. They brought back knowledge, goods, architectural ideas, a broader worldview. The younger sons who gambled everything on Eastern conquest, who succeeded briefly in establishing their own lordships, proved that the feudal system could adapt and extend itself in remarkable ways. Yet the ultimate lesson is about limits. Even the most sophisticated military system, even the most motivated warriors, even the blessing of the Church, cannot sustain conquest when the fundamental mathematics of distance, population, resources work against you. The Crusades were Europe's boldest experiment in projecting power beyond its borders. They succeeded brilliantly for a generation, limped along for another century, and then collapsed entirely. The knights who rode forth to save Jerusalem returned, if they returned at all, with wealth and scars and stories. But Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Holy Land remained Islamic. The crusading dream ended. What endured was the crusading ideal, the notion that European knights could undertake great adventures, that faith and courage could overcome impossible odds, that glory awaited those brave enough to seek it. This ideal would fuel the next great expression of knightly culture, the tournament. Picture a field in Champagne, France, on a summer morning in the year 1180. Pavilions in bright colours, red and gold, blue and white, green and silver, stretch across the meadow like a temporary city. Thousands of spectators crowd the viewing areas. Nobles in fine clothing, merchants hoping to sell their wares, peasants who have walked from nearby villages for this rare spectacle. Heralds announce the participants, war horses stamp and snort, knights in full armour adjust their weapons, test their lances, offer prayers to saints. This is a tournament, and it is not a game. Modern imagination, shaped by romantic literature and Hollywood films, envisions tournaments as formal jousts where knights in shining armour charge at each other with blunted lances, while ladies throw flowers and everyone observes elaborate rules of courtesy. The reality, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, is far more brutal and far more interesting. Early tournaments are essentially controlled warfare. Two teams of knights, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds on each side, clash in massive melees that rage across miles of countryside. They use real weapons, sharp swords, pointed lances, war axes. The objective is to capture opponents, hold them for ransom, and seize their valuable horses and armour. Men die in these events. They die frequently, necks break, skulls crack, horses fall and crush riders beneath them. In 1140, at a tournament in Cologne, 60 knights are killed in a single day. The Church condemns tournaments. Multiple popes issue decrees forbidding them, threatening excommunication for participants. The stated reason is moral. Tournaments promote vanity, violence, and waste. The underlying reason is political. Tournaments allow knights to practice warfare outside royal or ecclesiastical control. They create semi-independent military gatherings that could potentially become rebellions. Kings also view tournaments with suspicion. An assembly of armed knights, owing loyalty to various lords, presents obvious danger. Henry II of England bans tournaments in his realm for exactly this reason. He does not want his barons' knights fraternizing, forming bonds, potentially conspiring. But knights need tournaments. They need them economically and psychologically. Consider the economic logic. A knight must maintain combat readiness. His entire social identity depends on martial prowess. But actual warfare is sporadic. Campaigns last weeks or months, then peace returns for years. How does a knight practice when there is no war? How does he prove his worth? How does he earn wealth when his lord requires no military service? The tournament provides answers to all these questions. It is a marketplace where military skill converts directly into money. Here is how the system works. A knight entering a tournament risks his equipment and his person. If defeated and captured, he must pay ransom, typically the full value of his armor, weapons, and warhorse. These items are extraordinarily expensive. A full suit of mail, armor might cost the equivalent of a laborer's wages for several years. A trained warhorse costs even more. Losing a tournament can bankrupt a knight, but winning is immensely profitable. Every opponent you capture owes you ransom. Every horse you seize becomes your property. A skilled knight can earn more in a single tournament than most people see in a lifetime. The economics create a class of professional tournament fighters who travel from event to event, making their living through combat. The greatest of these professionals is William Marshall, and his career illuminates the tournament economy's remarkable potential. William is born around 1145, the fourth son of a minor English baron. Under primogeniture, he will inherit nothing. His prospects appear bleak. But William possesses extraordinary martial talent. He is strong, skilled with weapons, and crucially intelligent about combat tactics. At 16, he is knighted. At 20, he begins competing in tournaments. What follows is the most successful combat sports career in medieval history. Over the next 16 years, William Marshall competes in tournaments throughout France, Flanders, and England. He captures over 500 knights. 500. Each capture yields ransom money, equipment, horses. William becomes wealthy, then very wealthy, then spectacularly wealthy, all from tournament winnings. His success stems from several factors. First, raw skill. William is simply better at fighting than most opponents. He can unseat a charging knight with precision. He can fight on foot when unhorsed. He endures through stamina when others tire. Second, strategic thinking. William studies opponents, identifies weaknesses, chooses when to engage and when to avoid stronger fighters. Third, teamwork. William often fights alongside a partner, a fellow knight named Roger de Gougy. They watch each other's backs, coordinate attacks, and split ransoms. This partnership proves more effective than individual glory-seeking. But tournaments are not merely money-making opportunities. They serve critical political functions that make them indispensable to medieval governance. For kings, tournaments are intelligence-gathering operations. A tournament reveals which knights are skilled, which lords can field impressive contingents, which regions possess strong military capacity. A king, watching a tournament, assesses his realm's strength without the expense and danger of actual war. He observes who allies with whom, which families are rising, which are declining. The tournament field is a political map drawn in real time. Tournaments also serve as pressure release valves. Knights are trained for violence. Without outlets for their aggression, they become bandits or rebels. Tournaments channel that violence into controlled, ritualized combat. Better that knights fight each other in regulated melees than raid neighboring territories or plot against their lords. Furthermore, tournaments function as networking events for the knightly class. Between bouts, in the pavilions and feasting halls, nobles negotiate deals. Marriage alliances are arranged. Vassals meet potential lords. Landless knights seek employment with wealthy barons. The tournament is a job fair, a marriage market, and a social club simultaneously. Consider what transpires in those pavilions. A great lord hosts a feast after the day's fighting. Perhaps 50 or 100 knights attend, along with their squires and servants. Wine flows freely. Musicians play. The knights boast about their prowess, exaggerate their victories, mock their defeats with dark humour. But beneath the camaraderie, serious business occurs. A baron seeking to hire knights for an upcoming campaign approaches, promising fighters. He offers retainer fees, regular payment in exchange for guaranteed service. A landless knight who performed well that day might leave the tournament with employment secured, perhaps even a small fief if the baron is generous and the knight sufficiently impressive. A father with a daughter of marriageable age discusses potential matches with other fathers. Marriages in the knightly class are economic transactions. The bride brings a dowry land, money, connections. The groom brings martial skill and family alliances. A tournament allows fathers to assess potential sons-in-law personally. Does the young knight fight bravely? Does he conduct himself honourably? Can he manage defeat without losing composure? These qualities predict how he will manage an estate and represent the family. The mothers and daughters, watching from the stands or confined to the pavilions, have their own assessments to make. A lady observes which knights fight most skillfully, which carry themselves with grace, which show mercy to defeated opponents. These observations inform her preferences, though her preferences may or may not influence her father's decision. Medieval marriage is pragmatic, but compatibility matters if only for producing stable households. The tournament economy extends beyond the fighting field. An entire commercial ecosystem develops around these events. Armour merchants follow the tournament circuit, repairing damaged mail, selling replacement pieces, offering complete suits to knights who lost everything in defeat. They make fortunes from this itinerant trade. Horse traders bring war horses, palfreys for travel, pack animals. A good warhorse is an investment equivalent to a luxury car in modern terms, and traders who can provide quality animals at fair prices become wealthy. Provisioners supply food for thousands: bread, meat, ale, wine. They set up temporary markets around the tournament grounds. Innkeepers and landlords rent rooms in nearby towns, charging premium prices during tournament season. Prostitutes arrive, knowing that young men with money and testosterone frequent tournaments. Merchants sell jewelry, fine cloth, weapons, religious relics, and exotic goods. From the east, the economic impact on host regions can be substantial. A major tournament brings thousands of visitors spending money freely. Local economies boom temporarily. Towns compete to host tournaments for this reason, offering facilities and guarantees of safe conduct. Some tournaments become annual institutions. The tournaments of Champagne, held regularly in northeastern France, attract international participation. Knights from England, Germany, Italy, and Spain travel to Champagne for the competition and the commercial opportunities. These events help establish Champagne as a major medieval trade centre. The fairs of Champagne, famous throughout Europe for commerce, grow partly from the connections forged at tournaments. Yet tournaments remain dangerous, and not merely from combat. The Church's opposition creates legal complexities. Knights who die in tournaments, officially condemned by papal decree, might be denied Christian burial. This threat encourages knights to receive last rites before competing, just in case. Some tournaments are held in defiance of local bishops, creating jurisdictional conflicts. Kings who ban tournaments must enforce those bans, leading to arrests and confiscations that breed resentment. By the late 12th century, Richard the Lionheart of England recognizes the futility of banning tournaments. English knights simply travel to France to compete. Richard legalizes tournaments in England, but requires licenses and fees. This pragmatic compromise generates royal revenue while allowing controlled practice of warfare. It is classic medieval problem-solving. If you cannot eliminate an activity, regulate and tax it. The tournaments themselves evolve. The completely uncontrolled melees gradually give way to more structured formats. The joust single combat between two knights charging at each other with lances becomes increasingly popular. Jousts are more predictable, easier to organize, and provide clearer displays of individual skill. They are also less deadly, especially once blunted weapons become standard for certain types of competition. This evolution reflects changing attitudes toward knightly violence. As the 13th century progresses, the Church's peace and truce of God restrictions become more internalized. Knights develop more elaborate codes of conduct. Chivalry, a term derived from the French word for knight, chevalier, becomes an entire philosophy governing knightly behavior. Chivalric ideals emphasize courage, loyalty, generosity, and protection of the weak. A true knight should fight bravely but mercifully. He should honor his oaths absolutely. He should be generous in victory and gracious in defeat. He should defend women, children, and the church. He should prefer death to dishonor. These ideals are aspirational rather than descriptive. Most knights fall short, but the ideals matter because they create social pressure. A knight who behaves dishonorably, who murders prisoners, rapes women, breaks oaths, or shows cowardice, loses status among his peers. He becomes unmarriageable. Other knights refuse to associate with him. In a society where reputation is currency, dishonor is devastating. Tournaments become theatres where chivalric ideals are performed. Knights adopt elaborate heraldic devices, unique combinations of colours and symbols on shields and surcoats that identify them and their lineages. Heralds learn to recognize hundreds of these devices, announcing each knight as he enters the field. The ceremony, the pageantry, the formal courtesy between opponents, all this transforms combat into ritual. Yet beneath the ritual, the stakes remain real. Even in regulated jousts with blunted lances, knights die. In 1359, during a joust at Windsor, a knight named Sir John de Vere is killed when a lance penetrates his helmet's eyelet. In 1428, a German prince dies similarly. The danger never entirely disappears, and perhaps this is essential. Without real risk, tournaments would lose their meaning. They would become mere shows rather than tests of courage. The tournament's political importance peaks in the 14th century. Kings used tournaments to display power and build loyalty. Edward III of England hosts elaborate tournaments modelled on Arthurian legend, creating the Order of the Garter, an exclusive knightly society that bonds England's greatest warriors to the crown through ceremony and shared identity. These events are political theatre designed to reinforce feudal bonds through spectacle and shared experience. But tournaments also reveal tensions within the feudal system. The very qualities that make a great tournament fighter, individual prowess, personal glory, and competitive drive, can undermine the collective discipline required for effective warfare. A knight who fights brilliantly in single combat may charge recklessly in battle, disrupting formations and endangering comrades. The tournament valorizes the individual. Warfare requires the group. This tension becomes critical as military technology evolves. The skills honed in tournaments, lance work, mounted combat, individual dueling prove increasingly irrelevant against massed infantry with pikes or longbows. The tournament preserves a type of warfare that actual battlefields are abandoning. Still, for 2 centuries, from the mid-12th to the mid-14th century, tournaments serve as the economic and social heart of knightly culture. They are where landless knights earn their fortunes, where marriages are negotiated, where reputations are made or destroyed, where kings assess their military strength, where the chivalric ideal is performed and tested. William Marshal, who begins as a 4th son with no inheritance, ends his life as Earl of Pembroke, one of the richest and most powerful men in England. His rise comes through tournament winnings invested wisely, through marriages made possible by his reputation, through royal service earned by demonstrated capability. He becomes Regent of England during the minority of King Henry III, essentially ruling the kingdom. His career proves the tournament economy's potential for social mobility. In a society otherwise rigid in its hierarchies, tournaments offer a path upward for those with courage and skill. This is perhaps why knights defend tournaments so fiercely against church and royal prohibitions. Tournaments are their meritocracy, their stock market, their arena for advancement. As the 14th century progresses and military reality diverges from tournament fantasy, tournaments become increasingly anachronistic, but they do not disappear. Instead, they transform into pure spectacle, a gorgeous, expensive, politically important displays that bear little resemblance to actual warfare. They become the final performance of an ideal that reality is abandoning. That abandonment, driven by cold mathematics and technological change, forms the next chapter in the knight's story. For while knights joust in their pavilions, on distant battlefields, a new type of warfare is emerging, one where courage and individual skill matter far less than formation, discipline, and projectile weapons. One where expensive knights become liabilities rather than assets. The age of the tournament is ending. The age of infantry has begun. Consider the arithmetic of medieval warfare. A knight represents the agricultural surplus of 40 peasant families, years of training, expensive equipment, and constant maintenance. He is the medieval equivalent of a main battle tank, devastating when used correctly, but expensive to field and vulnerable under the wrong conditions. For 3 centuries, from roughly 1050 to 1350, this investment yields positive returns. Knights dominate European battlefields. They are the decisive arm in nearly every major engagement. Then the equation changes. August 26, 1346. A muddy field near the village of Crécy in northern France. The French army approaches, perhaps 35,000 strong, including at least 9,000 mounted knights. The flower of French chivalry, the most prestigious military force in Europe. They face an English army of perhaps 12,000, fewer than 3,000 of them knights. By every conventional measure, the French should win. They have superior numbers, more heavy cavalry, the home advantage. But the English have something else. They have longbowmen. The English longbow is not a new weapon. Bows have existed for millennia. But the Welsh longbow, adopted and refined by English armies, represents a revolution in effectiveness. It is 6 feet tall, made from yew wood, requiring years of practice to master. An experienced longbowman can shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute accurately at ranges exceeding 200 yards. Each arrow, tipped with a narrow bodkin point, can penetrate chainmail and even plate armor under the right conditions. The critical factor is not individual lethality but volume of fire. One archer might kill 1 knight, but 5,000 archers shooting simultaneously create a steel storm that no cavalry can survive. At Crécy, King Edward III positions his army defensively. His knights dismount and fight as heavy infantry, anchoring the line. On their flanks he places thousands of longbowmen in V-shaped formations that create interlocking fields of fire. Any cavalry charging the centre must ride through converging arrow storms from multiple angles. Edward then waits. The French army arrives in disorder after a long march. Professional Genoese crossbowmen in French service advance first, but a sudden rainstorm has dampened their bowstrings. The English longbows, kept dry, remain effective. As the Genoese withdraw under English arrow fire, French knights, eager for glory and frustrated by delay, charge. Imagine witnessing this charge. Thousands of armoured horsemen thundering across the field, lances levelled, the ground shaking beneath their advance. These are not merely soldiers, they are the hereditary warrior elite of France, men who have trained for combat since childhood, whose very identities are built on martial supremacy. They have never lost to English armies. They expect victory as their birthright. The English archers release. The sky darkens with arrows. Not dozens, not hundreds, tens of thousands of arrows arcing upward, then plunging down onto the charging cavalry. Horses scream and fall, trapping riders beneath them. Knights topple from saddles, arrows protruding from joints in their armour. Those who reach the English lines find dismounted English knights in defensive formations, supported by archers who shoot at point-blank range. The French charge again, and again, and again. Perhaps 15 separate assaults over the course of the afternoon and into darkness. Each time, English arrows decimate them. By nightfall, French casualties exceed 4,000, including at least 1,500 knights and nobles. English losses are perhaps 100 to 200 men. The mathematics are brutal. Each French knight killed represents an enormous investment lost. Training, equipment, horses, all destroyed by commoners shooting wooden bows. Each English archer costs a fraction to equip and maintain compared to a knight. The return on investment favours the English overwhelmingly. Crécy is not an anomaly. 10 years later, at Poitiers, another English army defeats another French force using the same tactics. In 1315, at Agincourt, the pattern repeats with even more devastating effect. French cavalry charging into English longbow fire suffers catastrophic losses. The supposed invincibility of heavy cavalry is shattered definitively. But the lesson of Crécy is not merely about archery. It is about cost-benefit analysis in warfare. Knights have become too expensive relative to their effectiveness. Consider the Swiss, who reach the same conclusion through different means. The Swiss Confederacy consists of towns and rural communes in the Alps, lacking the agricultural surplus to support many knights. Instead, they develop infantry tactics using weapons available to any farmer: pikes, halberds, and disciplined formations. A pike is simply a very long spear, 18 feet or more. Individually, a pikeman is vulnerable, but pikes wielded in dense formation create a wall of points that cavalry cannot penetrate. The Swiss train their men to maintain formation discipline under any circumstances. They fight in massive blocks of several thousand men, pikes projecting outward, creating a bristling hedgehog that can advance or hold as needed. In 1315, at Morgarten, Swiss pikemen destroy an Austrian army of knights. The knights, attempting to force a narrow mountain pass, cannot deploy their cavalry effectively. Swiss infantry ambush them, pulling knights from horses, crushing them with halberds. In 1386, at Sempach, Swiss infantry again defeat Austrian knights, despite the Austrians' numerical superiority. The Swiss discover that disciplined infantry, properly trained and motivated, can reliably defeat cavalry at a fraction of the cost. A Swiss pikeman requires basic equipment: a pike, simple armour, perhaps a helmet. Training occurs through compulsory militia service. The system is affordable, scalable, and effective. Other regions notice. By the 15th century, Swiss mercenaries are the most sought-after soldiers in Europe. They hire themselves out to Italian city-states, French kings, German princes, and the papacy. They are expensive compared to ordinary soldiers, but cheap compared to knights, and far more reliable in combat. They fight in their massed formations, refuse to break or retreat, and win consistently. The Swiss model proves that the feudal equation no longer works. Why maintain a hereditary warrior class requiring vast resources when you can hire professional infantry who perform better at lower cost? Then comes gunpowder, and the calculus shifts again, even more dramatically. Early firearms are primitive. Arquebuses and muskets are inaccurate, slow to reload, and unreliable. They frequently misfire. Rain renders them useless. They lack the range or accuracy of longbows. But they have one overwhelming advantage: minimal training required. You can teach a peasant to fire an arquebus in a week. Creating an effective longbowman takes years. Creating a knight takes decades. Artillery develops more rapidly and with more immediate impact. Early cannon are crude, dangerous to their own crews, and barely mobile. But they can do something no previous weapon can: breach castle walls. A castle that took 20 years to build, representing an enormous capital investment, can be reduced to rubble in days by cannon fire. In 1453, at the fall of Constantinople, Ottoman cannon battered down the Theodosian walls fortifications that had protected the city for 1,000 years. The walls are 20 feet thick in places, with multiple defensive layers. They have resisted dozens of sieges. Cannon render them obsolete in weeks. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, falls not to superior strategy or courage, but to superior technology. Castles, the physical embodiments of feudal power, become increasingly indefensible. Engineers respond by designing new fortifications lower, thicker walls with angular bastions that deflect cannon fire. These Tres Italienne fortifications are effective, but even more expensive than traditional castles. Only rich states can afford them. Individual barons cannot. The ability to project military power through fortifications shifts from feudal nobility to centralized governments. Kings recognize the implications. Cannon and firearms allow them to reduce the military importance of their nobility while increasing royal power. Why depend on feudal levies of knights when you can hire professional infantry, armed with firearms and supported by royal artillery? The transition is gradual but inexorable. In France, King Louis XI, ruling from 1461 to 1483, systematically replaces feudal military obligations with royal standing armies funded by taxation. He creates the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, permanent military companies under royal command, paid from royal treasury, loyal to the crown rather than to feudal lords. Louis is cold, calculating, completely unsentimental about military traditions. He cares nothing for chivalric ideals or knightly glory. He cares about effectiveness and control. His armies mix cavalry, infantry, and artillery in combined arms forces. They are professional, disciplined, and responsive to centralized command in ways feudal levies never were. Other European monarchs follow Louis's example. By the early 16th century, most major kingdoms maintain standing armies. These forces are expensive. Taxation increases dramatically to fund them, but they provide several advantages over feudal systems. First, reliability. A professional soldier serves for pay, not feudal obligation. He obeys orders or loses employment. He does not debate whether his service contract requires him to fight this particular campaign or argue about the duration of his military service. Second, standardization. Professional armies can implement uniform training, tactics, and equipment. Feudal levies consist of individual knights, each with their own armor, weapons, and fighting styles. Professional armies fight as coordinated units with interchangeable soldiers. Third, year-round availability. Feudal military service is typically limited 40 days per year. or for specific defensive campaigns. Professional soldiers serve continuously, allowing campaigns to extend beyond seasonal limitations. Fourth, combined arms integration. Professional armies combine pike formations, firearm units, cavalry, and artillery into mutually supporting forces. Each arm covers the weaknesses of the others. Pikes protect arquebusiers while they reload. Cavalry exploits gaps in enemy formations. Artillery suppresses enemy positions. This integration requires extensive training and coordination, impossible in feudal levies. The knight, evolved to dominate a specific type of warfare, cannot adapt quickly enough. His training emphasizes individual combat, mounted shock tactics, and personal glory. The new warfare emphasizes formation discipline, combined arms, and subordination to overall strategy. These are fundamentally different skill sets. Moreover, the economic equation has reversed. Where knights once provided positive returns on investment, they now represent negative returns. They are more expensive than professional soldiers, less flexible, and increasingly ineffective against infantry armed with pikes and firearms. Consider the Battle of Ravenna in 1512. French heavy cavalry charges Spanish positions. The Spanish infantry, armed with arquebuses and supported by field artillery, inflict terrible casualties. The French cavalry eventually breaks through, but at devastating cost. The battle is technically a French victory, but French losses are so severe that the campaign fails. This is the new arithmetic. Even when heavy cavalry succeeds tactically, the costs often exceed the gains. Some knights recognize reality and adapt. They learn to fight as combined arms commanders, integrating cavalry with infantry and artillery. They master the new technologies, including gunpowder weapons. They transition from feudal warriors to professional officers in standing armies. Others cling to tradition and become increasingly irrelevant. They continue emphasizing individual combat prowess, mounted charges, and chivalric ideals even as battlefields render these skills obsolete. They are dinosaurs, magnificent in their way, but doomed by changed conditions. The social implications are profound. The entire feudal structure rests on the military necessity of knights. If knights are no longer militarily decisive, the justification for their privileged position collapses. Why should one man hold vast estates, rule over hundreds of peasants, and enjoy hereditary status, if he cannot provide the military service that supposedly justifies these privileges? European society does not immediately restructure. Aristocracy persists for centuries after losing its military rationale. Social inertia is powerful, but the intellectual foundation erodes. By the 16th century, political theorists increasingly advocate centralized royal authority rather than feudal distribution of power. They argue that effective governance requires professional bureaucracy and standing armies, not feudal contracts and knightly levies. The economic shift from land-based to money-based power accelerates this transition. As trade increases and commercial economies develop, liquid capital becomes more important than landed estates. Merchants, bankers, and manufacturers accumulate wealth that rivals or exceeds that of nobility. These bourgeois classes do not fit feudal hierarchies. They are neither peasants nor warriors. They create wealth through commerce and production, not land ownership or military service. Kings increasingly ally with bourgeois classes against feudal nobility. The bourgeoisie provide tax revenue that funds professional armies. In exchange, kings grant commercial privileges, legal protections, and political representation. This alliance gradually undermines feudal power structures. By the late 15th century, the transition is evident across Europe. Spain, France, and England all develop powerful centralized monarchies supported by professional armies and funded by taxation. The Holy Roman Empire remains feudally fragmented and consequently becomes a political backwater unable to compete with centralized neighbors. The contrast is instructive. Feudalism persists where geography prevents centralization, but it loses ground wherever centralized alternatives emerge. The knight's military obsolescence becomes complete by the mid-16th century. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, Spanish arquebusiers slaughter French cavalry, capturing King Francis I. The heavily armoured knight, once the battlefield's apex predator, has become an expensive target. Armour thick enough to stop bullets is too heavy for horses to carry. Knights who remove armour for mobility become vulnerable to gunfire. There is no good solution. Some knights pivot away from traditional cavalry roles entirely. They become administrators, diplomats, courtiers. They translate their social status into political influence within emerging nation-states. Their military function disappears, but their class position persists through adaptation. Others seek new frontiers, where old military models still apply. Spanish conquistadors discover that in the Americas, against opponents without gunpowder weapons or effective anti-cavalry tactics, the knight's charge remains devastatingly effective. This creates a temporary reprieve, a final theatre where mounted warriors can demonstrate their traditional prowess. But this is epilogue, not Renaissance. The knight's tactical dominance, which shaped European warfare and society for 3 centuries, has ended. The mathematics costs versus benefits, effectiveness versus alternatives, no longer favour heavy cavalry. What made knights supreme in the 11th century renders them obsolete in the 16th. Specialization. They are optimized for a specific type of combat that no longer dominates battlefields. The next chapter belongs to those who adapt rather than those who cling to tradition. Some knights make this transition successfully. They become something new, retaining their status, but abandoning their defining military function. Others vanish into history, their names forgotten, their estates divided, their military traditions preserved only in romantic literature. The age of the knight is ending. Not through sudden catastrophe, but through gradual irrelevance, through arithmetic that no longer supports their expense, through technological and tactical evolution that renders their skills obsolete. It is the mathematics of defeat, cold, inexorable, final. Evolution, whether biological or social, favours not the strongest but the most adaptable. When environments change, species face a choice: adapt or perish. The same principle applies to military classes. When knights lose their tactical dominance in the 16th century, some vanish from history. Others transform, finding new roles where their skills, status, and ambition can flourish. The difference between survival and extinction lies not in clinging to tradition, but in recognizing when tradition has become liability. Consider England, an island nation whose strategic requirements differ fundamentally from continental powers. English knights, observing their obsolescence on land battlefields, make a calculated pivot. They become naval commanders. The logic is elegant. England's security depends on controlling the seas surrounding it. Naval power prevents invasion, protects trade, projects force abroad. But effective naval warfare requires many of the same qualities that knights possess: courage under fire, command presence, tactical thinking, comfort with violence. A knight accustomed to leading men in cavalry charges can lead men in ship-to-ship combat. The transition is not immediate or universal. Many English knights remain traditional cavalry officers, but the most perceptive recognize opportunity. By the mid-16th century, during the reign of Henry VIII, English nobility increasingly serve as naval officers. They command royal warships, lead expeditions, and engage in state-sanctioned piracy against Spanish treasure fleets. Sir Francis Drake exemplifies this transformation. Born into minor gentry, Drake lacks the resources or inclination for traditional knighthood. Instead, he goes to sea. He masters navigation, ship handling, and naval combat. He raids Spanish colonies in the Caribbean with devastating effectiveness. When Spain's Great Armada threatens England in 1588, Drake serves as vice admiral, helping to defeat the invasion through superior seamanship and tactics. Queen Elizabeth I knights Drake for his services. This is significant. The knighthood recognizes not cavalry prowess or tournament victories, but naval achievements. The definition of knightly service has expanded to include new forms of warfare. English nobility adapts its identity to match strategic reality. This adaptation proves remarkably successful. For the next 3 centuries, British naval dominance shapes global history. English, later British aristocrats command the ships that establish and maintain a worldwide empire. The Royal Navy becomes the career path for younger sons of nobility, providing the same opportunities for advancement that tournaments once offered. Naval officers develop their own culture, codes of honor, and traditions that echo chivalric ideals while serving modern military needs. The transition from horse to ship represents successful adaptation. English knights recognize that their core competencies, leadership, tactical thinking, and personal courage transfer to new contexts. They abandon the specific techniques of mounted combat while preserving the underlying warrior ethos. Other knights make different adaptations with varying success. In Italy, the fragmented political landscape creates opportunities for a new profession, the condottiero. Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries consists of dozens of independent city-states: Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa, Naples, constantly warring against each other. These wealthy commercial republics need military forces, but distrust standing armies that might threaten republican governments. Their solution is to hire mercenary commanders who recruit, train, and lead military companies on short-term contracts. The condottieri are military entrepreneurs. They are knights, typically from minor nobility, who create private military corporations. A successful condottiero maintains a permanent force of professional soldiers, cavalry, infantry, artillery, and rents this force to the highest bidder. City-states pay substantial sums for these services, and condottieri who prove effective become extraordinarily wealthy. Consider Francesco Sforza. Born in 1401 to a condottiero father, Francesco inherits his father's military company. He expands it, wins victories, and becomes the most sought-after military contractor in Italy. He serves Venice, then Florence, then Milan. In 1450, through a combination of military success and political maneuvering, he seizes control of Milan itself, transforming from hired commander to reigning duke. Sforza's career demonstrates how knights can adapt to commercial warfare. He thinks strategically, not just tactically. He understands that reputation matters as much as battlefield success. He negotiates contracts carefully, ensuring payment before committing forces. He maintains his military company as a business, recruiting skilled soldiers, investing in equipment, managing finances. He is simultaneously warrior, businessman, and politician. But the condottiero system has inherent problems. Mercenary commanders have perverse incentives. They profit from war, so they have little interest in decisive victories that end conflicts quickly. They prefer prolonged campaigns with minimal casualties. Their casualties. Italian warfare of this period becomes theatrical, with elaborate maneuvers, frequent sieges, and remarkably few battles. When battles occur, they often end with negotiated surrenders rather than annihilating combat. The system works adequately when all participants follow the same rules. But when France invades Italy in 1494 with a professional army willing to fight destructively, the condottieri prove inadequate. French forces, uninterested in preserving Italian military traditions, simply smash through opposition. The condottiero system collapses under pressure from more ruthless competitors. Still, for over a century, Italian knights successfully pivot to mercenary entrepreneurship. They adapt their military skills to commercial frameworks, making fortunes in the process. Some succeed spectacularly, like Sforza. Others fail and disappear, but the attempt itself demonstrates adaptability. Across the Mediterranean, Spanish knights find their own adaptation opportunity, the conquest of the Americas. When Christopher Columbus returns from his 1592 voyage, describing lands populated by people without horses, without steel weapons, without gunpowder, Spanish knights recognize a remarkable circumstance. Here is a theatre where their traditional military advantages remain intact. Against indigenous opponents, mounted knights in armor are nearly invincible. The conquistadors are younger sons, minor nobility, and ambitious commoners hoping to become nobility through conquest. They understand that Spain offers them limited prospects. Established families control the best lands. Competition for royal favor is intense. But the Americas represent open opportunity, vast territories to conquer, plunder to seize, estates to establish. Hernán Cortés, conquering the Aztec Empire with fewer than 600 Spanish soldiers, demonstrates the effectiveness of traditional knightly tactics against opponents unprepared for them. His cavalry charge at the Battle of Otumba in 1520 turns near disaster into victory. Aztec warriors, facing mounted knights for the first time, break and flee. The psychological impact of horses, animals, unknown in the Americas, gives Spanish cavalry enormous advantage. Francisco Pizarro conquers the Inca Empire with even fewer men, using similar tactics plus audacious deception. He captures the Inca Emperor Atahualpa through betrayal, holds him for ransom, then executes him despite receiving payment. It is not chivalrous by medieval European standards, but it is effective. Pizarro establishes himself as governor, controls vast territories, and becomes immensely wealthy. The conquistadors are knights operating in circumstances that Europeans have not experienced for centuries. Complete military superiority. They face opponents who cannot counter their cavalry, cannot penetrate their armor, cannot match their steel weapons. It is like traveling backward in time to an era when knightly advantages were overwhelming. But this reprieve is temporary and geographically limited. The conquistadors establish feudal-style encomienda systems in the Americas, granting themselves estates worked by indigenous labor. They become colonial nobility, preserving knightly social structures in new territories. Yet they are not reversing the broader trend, merely finding a pocket of history where old methods still function. Within generations, the Americas develop different social structures. The children and grandchildren of conquistadors become colonial aristocrats more interested in agricultural production and trade than military adventure. The knightly identity dilutes. By the 17th century, American-born Spanish nobility bears little resemblance to medieval knights beyond superficial titles and genealogies. Meanwhile, in Europe, knights who cannot or will not adapt face extinction as a meaningful class. Many become courtiers. The transformation from warrior to courtier is profound. A courtier's power comes not from military capacity but from proximity to the monarch, from influence over royal decisions, from skill in navigating court politics. This requires entirely different abilities, eloquence, cultural sophistication, understanding of etiquette, capacity for intrigue. Some knights make this transition successfully. They trade swords for elegant clothing, military camps for palace apartments, battlefield tactics for political maneuvering. They become administrators in expanding royal bureaucracies, diplomats conducting international negotiations, governors managing provinces. Their nobility grants them access to these positions, but success requires civilian skills. The court of Louis XIV in 17th century France represents the culmination of this transformation. Louis creates an elaborate court system at Versailles, where French nobility must attend him constantly. He assigns specific roles, titles and ceremonies that keep aristocrats busy with courtly duties rather than military adventures or political scheming. A duke's most important task might be holding the king's candle during a bedtime ritual. It is deliberately demeaning, reducing warriors to servants, but it is also domesticating the nobility, making them dependent on royal favour rather than military power. This represents adaptation through surrender. The nobility preserves its privileges, titles, estates, social status, by abandoning its military function. Aristocrats become ornamental, their purpose purely social rather than martial. They are evolutionary dead ends, preserved artificially by social conventions rather than functional necessity. Yet even in this decline, some knightly ideals persist. The notion of honour, of personal courage, of loyalty to one's word, these concepts survive the knight's military obsolescence. They shape emerging military cultures in new contexts. When European nations create professional officer corps in the 17th and 18th centuries, they consciously adopt chivalric principles. Officers are expected to be gentlemen, to conduct themselves honourably, to show courage under fire, to treat enemies with respect. Military academies teach not merely tactics and strategy, but also classical education and refined manners. The officer class becomes the knight's spiritual heir, preserving martial values within modern military structures. This cultural transmission is selective. The new officer class abandons many aspects of knighthood: feudal obligations, individual combat emphasis, tournament culture, while retaining others. The result is something hybrid: professional soldiers with aristocratic self-conception, trained in modern warfare but socialized in traditional honor codes. Some military traditions embrace this heritage explicitly. The Prussian Junker class, minor German nobility with military traditions, dominates the Prussian and later German officer corps for centuries. They see themselves as knights adapted to modern warfare, combining aristocratic identity with professional military expertise. This fusion produces highly effective armies, and also terrible tragedies when honor codes clash with modern strategic realities. The ultimate question is whether the knight truly adapts or merely delays extinction through cosmetic changes. A knight who becomes a naval officer is no longer a knight in any meaningful sense. He is a naval officer with aristocratic background. A condottiero is a military contractor, not a feudal warrior. A conquistador is a colonial adventurer, not a medieval knight. A courtier is simply a courtier. Perhaps the honest assessment is that the knight, as a functional military class, does go extinct. What survives is not the knight, but the idea of the knight, the cultural memory of martial nobility, of personal honour, of courage and loyalty. This idea proves remarkably durable, influencing military culture for centuries after the actual knight disappears. Why does this idea persist? Perhaps because it addresses permanent human needs. Societies require warriors, and warriors require identity frameworks that make their dangerous profession meaningful. The knight provides such a framework. Service is honourable, courage is virtuous, loyalty transcends self-interest, sacrifice earns glory. These concepts motivate soldiers in any era. Modern special forces operators, elite military units like Navy SEALs or British SAS, consciously invoke knightly traditions. They speak of warrior brotherhood, of codes of honour, of refusing to leave comrades behind. They see themselves as warrior monks, dedicated to a calling beyond mere employment. This is the knight's legacy, not tactical techniques or feudal relationships, but a self-conception that elevates martial service to sacred duty. The knight's story, then, ends not with complete extinction, but with transformation and dispersion. The specific historical phenomenon, feudal heavy cavalry as the dominant military force, disappears by the 16th century. But elements of knightly culture seed themselves into successor institutions: naval officers, professional armies, colonial adventurers, courtly aristocracy, and modern elite warriors. Some adaptations succeed. English naval nobility builds an empire. Spanish conquistadors establish colonial kingdoms. Professional officer corps maintain aristocratic traditions within modern militaries. These represent evolutionary success changing form to preserve function or status. Other adaptations fail. Italian condottieri prove inadequate against serious military competition. French courtier nobles become irrelevant parasites during the Revolution and lose their heads to guillotines. These represent evolutionary dead ends. Preservation without adaptation. Form without function. The lesson is universal. When your environment changes fundamentally, you must change with it, or perish. Those who recognize change early and adapt boldly often thrive. Those who deny reality and cling to tradition become extinct. The successful knight of the 16th century is the one who stops being a knight and becomes something new while retaining whatever elements of knightly identity remain functional. This is how military systems die. Not always through spectacular defeat, but often through gradual irrelevance, through economic unviability, through replacement by more cost-effective alternatives. And this is how military traditions survive, by abandoning their original forms while preserving their animating ideals, by finding new expressions for permanent human values, by adapting rather than resisting. The age of the armored knight on his warhorse has ended, but the idea of the knight, the warrior bound by honor, serving a cause greater than himself, facing danger with courage, that idea rides forward into new ages, on new mounts, serving new masters, but carrying still some echo of that distant medieval glory. Stand back now, far enough to see the entire arc. 6 centuries of European history, from roughly 900 to 1500, dominated by a single military system. The mounted knight rises from chaos, shapes society in his image, rules battlefields with terrible effectiveness, and then fades into irrelevance. What can strategists, leaders, and anyone navigating change learn from this rise and fall? The patterns are clear if we examine them carefully. They echo across history, repeating in different contexts with similar outcomes. The knight's story is not merely medieval history. It is a case study in adaptation, obsolescence, and the dangerous seduction of past success. Asterisk, asterisk. The danger of over-specialization. Asterisk, asterisk. Consider first the problem of over-specialization. The knight evolves to dominate a specific type of warfare, mounted shock combat on European terrain against opponents using similar tactics. At this, he excels magnificently. A charging knight can break infantry formations, scatter lighter cavalry, and project power across territories. For 3 centuries, this specialization yields enormous returns. But specialization creates vulnerability. An organism optimized for one environment struggles when that environment changes. The knight's entire identity, his training, equipment, tactics, social status depends on conditions remaining constant. When longbows, pikes, and gunpowder alter the battlefield calculus, the knight cannot adapt quickly enough. His years of training in mounted combat become liability rather than asset. His expensive equipment, optimized for cavalry charges, proves inadequate against projectile weapons. Modern parallels abound. Corporations that dominate through specialized expertise and mature technologies often fail when disruptive innovations emerge. Kodak perfected chemical photography and missed the digital revolution. Nokia mastered mobile phones and failed to anticipate smartphones. Both companies possessed enormous resources, talented people, and market dominance. But their specialization in existing technologies blinded them to fundamental change. Military history repeats this pattern constantly. Battleships dominated naval warfare until aircraft carriers made them vulnerable. Cavalry remained prestigious in many armies well into the 20th century, despite obvious obsolescence. The French army in 1940, arguably the world's finest military in traditional terms, collapsed against German combined arms tactics it could not counter. The lesson: excellence within an existing paradigm does not guarantee survival when paradigms shift. In fact, past success often impedes adaptation because it creates institutional momentum, cultural attachment, and vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Asterisk, asterisk. When technology disrupts politics, asterisk, asterisk. The night's rise and fall also illuminate how military technology shapes political systems. Feudalism emerges because cavalry warfare requires distributed economic support. Centralized states lack the administrative capacity to field large cavalry forces directly, so they decentralize, granting land to warriors who maintain themselves locally. The military technology of the stirrup and heavy cavalry literally restructures society. Similarly, the decline of feudalism accelerates when gunpowder shifts military advantage back towards centralization. Cannon and firearms enable professional armies that require substantial capital investment but allow centralized command and control. Kings who can raise money through taxation can build powerful militaries independent of feudal nobility. Technology makes centralized states militarily superior, so political power centralizes. This pattern technology, determining political structure, appears throughout history. The printing press undermines church control of information, enabling reformation and eventually democracy. Railways allow nations to administer vast territories from central capitals, enabling 19th-century empires. The Internet creates new forms of distributed organization that challenge traditional hierarchies. Understanding this connection between technology and politics proves crucial for strategic thinking. When fundamental technologies change, political arrangements built on old technologies become vulnerable. Leaders who recognize these connections early can position themselves advantageously. Those who ignore them risk obsolescence. Asterisk, asterisk. The importance of adaptability over tradition. Asterisk, asterisk. The varying fates of different knightly lineages highlight the critical importance of adaptability. English knights, who pivot to naval command, thrive. Italian condottieri, who embrace mercenary entrepreneurship, succeed for a time. Spanish conquistadors, who recognize opportunities in the Americas, establish new kingdoms. Meanwhile, knights who insist on traditional cavalry roles become irrelevant or extinct. The successful adaptations share common characteristics. They recognize changed circumstances early. They identify which core competencies transfer to new contexts and which must be abandoned. They act decisively rather than waiting for circumstances to worsen. They are willing to sacrifice identity elements, fighting from horseback, feudal obligations, specific tactical techniques to preserve others, leadership, martial skill, aristocratic status. The failures also share commonalities. They deny or minimize changed circumstances. They believe past success guarantees future relevance. They prioritize form over function, preserving rituals and traditions even when these no longer serve practical purposes. They wait too long to adapt, until adaptation becomes impossible. This dynamic appears in every organization facing disruption. Successful companies reinvent themselves. Amazon evolving from bookstore to cloud computing giant. Apple pivoting from computers to mobile devices. Failed companies cling to existing business models. Blockbuster refusing to compete with streaming. Borders maintaining physical retail as e-commerce dominates. Individual careers follow similar patterns. Professionals who continuously update skills remain employable across changing economies. Those who rely entirely on expertise in obsolescent fields face unemployment. The adaptable survive. The rigid fail. Asterisk, asterisk. Network effects. Centralized versus distributed systems. Asterisk, asterisk. Feudalism represents a distributed network system for organizing power. Rather than flowing from a central authority, power distributes across numerous nodes, individual knights on their fiefs, barons in their castles, regional lords controlling territories. This distribution provides resilience. If one node fails, others continue functioning. The system lacks single points of failure. But distributed systems also have weaknesses. Coordination is difficult. Strategy fragments. Internal conflicts are common. Feudal Europe experiences constant civil wars as various nodes compete for dominance. The system prevents catastrophic collapse, but also prevents decisive collective action. Centralized systems, professional armies under royal command, bureaucratic administration, standardized taxation offer different trade-offs. They enable coordinated strategy, efficient resource allocation, rapid response to threats, but they create single points of failure. If the central authority collapses, the entire system can disintegrate. The transition from feudal to centralized systems occurs because, in military competition, centralized systems prove more effective. They can concentrate force, maintain permanent armies, and project power more reliably. The efficiency gains outweigh the resilience losses, at least in stable environments. Modern organizations face similar choices between distributed and centralized structures. Distributed organizations are resilient, adaptive, and innovative, but potentially chaotic and inefficient. Centralized organizations are efficient and powerful, but brittle and slow to adapt. The optimal structure depends on environmental stability and competitive pressures. Asterisk. The strategic weakness of romantic idealism. Asterisk. Chivalry. The code of knightly conduct, emphasizing honor, courage, loyalty, and protection of the weak, represents both strength and weakness. It motivates extraordinary sacrifice. Knights endure hardship, risk death, and serve loyally, partly because chivalric ideals make these actions meaningful. The code provides psychological framework that enables remarkable achievements, but chivalric idealism also creates strategic vulnerabilities. Knights at Crécy charge repeatedly into arrow storms, partly from courage, but also from inability to accept that their role has become obsolete. The code demands courage unto death. It does not accommodate tactical withdrawal or acknowledgement of changed circumstances. Idealism becomes suicide when reality no longer supports it. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople reveals another danger. Ideals are easily corrupted or manipulated. Crusaders who swore to defend Christianity slaughter Christians for Venetian commercial interests, all while invoking religious rhetoric. The gap between professed ideals and actual behavior becomes a chasm, yet idealism also proves powerfully motivating. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl with no military training, inspires French victories through sheer force of belief in her divine mission. The ideals, even when contradicted by reality, can generate action that changes reality. This is idealism's paradox. It is simultaneously delusional and effective. Modern organizations grapple with similar tensions. Corporate cultures emphasizing mission, values, and higher purpose motivate employees beyond mere financial incentives. But these cultures can also blind organizations to necessary changes or justify unethical behavior as serving greater goods. The challenge is maintaining motivating ideals while remaining pragmatic about changing circumstances. Elite units and the persistent belief in quality over quantity. The knight embodies a persistent human intuition that superior training, equipment, and individual excellence can overcome numerical disadvantage. For centuries this proves true. One knight defeats multiple peasant soldiers. A small force of knights can control large territories. Quality trumps quantity consistently, but eventually the equation reverses. When English longbowmen kill French knights at Crécy, when Swiss pikemen defeat Austrian cavalry, when Spanish arquebusiers slaughter French knights at Pavia, quantity multiplied by adequate training defeats quality. The crossover point occurs when training costs for effective infantry drop sufficiently, and when weapons technology reduces the knight's qualitative advantages. Modern militaries still believe in elite units, special forces, marines, commandos, and invest heavily in them. These units perform specialized missions regular forces cannot. They maintain the tradition that superior training and equipment can accomplish what numerical superiority cannot. Sometimes this proves true. Special operations succeed where conventional forces would fail. But the fundamental lesson from knightly decline remains relevant. There are limits to how much quality can compensate for quantity, especially when quality becomes expensive and quantity becomes effective. A military that invests everything in elite forces while neglecting mass capabilities risks replicating the knight's mistake. Balance matters. Context matters. What works in one scenario fails in another. Asterisk. Asterisk. The officer code and knightly legacy. Asterisk. Asterisk. Walk into any military academy, West Point, Sandhurst, St. Cyr, and you encounter the knight's ghost. Not literally, of course, but in the codes of conduct that govern officer behavior. Personal honor, courage under fire, loyalty to comrades, service before self, protection of those under one's command. These are chivalric principles adapted to modern contexts. This transmission of values across centuries demonstrates that some human needs transcend specific historical circumstances. Warriors in any era require motivating frameworks that make danger and sacrifice meaningful. The knight provides such a framework, one that proves adaptable to different technological and organizational contexts. Modern Special Forces operators, SEALs, Delta Force, SAS explicitly invoke warrior monk traditions. They emphasize brotherhood, specialized skills, elite status, and willingness to die for the mission. They see themselves as modern knights, carrying forward ancient traditions in contemporary forms. The specific tactics change completely, but the self-conception remains recognizable. This continuity suggests that the knight's most enduring legacy is not tactical but cultural. The idea that military service can be noble, that warriors can be more than killers, that martial excellence connects to moral excellence, these concepts outlive the mounted knight by centuries. They shape military culture worldwide, influencing how soldiers see themselves and how societies view them. Asterisk. Asterisk. The last Byzantine emperor and the end of eras asterisk asterisk. On May the 29th, 1453, as Ottoman forces breach Constantinople's walls, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, reportedly tears off his purple imperial robes, draws his sword, and charges into the melee as an ordinary soldier. He dies fighting, his body never definitively identified. It is, simultaneously, the end of the Roman Empire, which has endured in some form for over 2,000 years, and the end of the knight as a culturally dominant figure. Constantine's final charge is pure chivalric gesture. It accomplishes nothing strategically. Constantinople falls regardless, but the symbolic power is immense. The emperor chooses to die as a warrior rather than flee or surrender. He affirms that some things matter more than survival, honor, courage, commitment to one's people. It is a knight's death, given by an emperor who understands that his world is ending, and meets that ending on his own terms. This moment captures something essential about the knightly ideal. Yes, it is often impractical. Yes, it sometimes leads to unnecessary death, but it also represents human capacity to choose meaning over mere survival, to affirm values even in defeat, to die well when living well becomes impossible. These choices matter. They inspire others. They become stories that shape culture for generations. Don Quixote, the mad knight who tilts at windmills, represents the other side of this legacy. Written in 1605 by Miguel de Cervantes, the novel simultaneously mocks and mourns chivalric ideals. Quixote is ridiculous, living in a fantasy where knight-errantry still matters, where giants hide in windmills, where noble quests await. But he is also admirable in his commitment to ideals, his courage, his refusal to accept a world without romance. Cervantes, himself a veteran of the Battle of Lepanto where he lost use of his left hand, understands both the foolishness and the nobility of knightly traditions. His novel captures the moment when a culture recognizes its own obsolescence but cannot quite let go. The laughter is affectionate, the mockery is gentle, because even as Spain acknowledges that chivalry belongs to the past, it mourns that past's passing. Asterisk, asterisk. The eternal relevance of strategic principles. Asterisk. Asterisk. The knight story, spanning 6 centuries, ultimately teaches timeless strategic principles. Adapt or die. Recognize when circumstances change fundamentally. Don't let past success blind you to present reality. Understand how technology shapes political possibilities. Balance specialization with flexibility. Maintain motivating ideals while remaining pragmatic about implementation. Know when to preserve traditions and when to abandon them. These lessons apply far beyond medieval warfare. They illuminate business strategy, political movements, technological change, personal career development, and any situation where established systems face disruptive forces. The specifics change, stirrups and longbows become semiconductors and artificial intelligence, but the underlying dynamics remain constant. Perhaps most importantly, the knight's legacy reminds us that endings are not always failures. The knight's era ends, but elements of knightly culture persist and adapt, influencing military traditions worldwide. The specific form disappears, but the animating spirit continues. This is how human culture works. Nothing is entirely preserved, nothing entirely lost. Everything transforms. When we see modern warriors, in whatever form, soldiers, first responders, even individuals facing personal crises with courage, we see echoes of the knight. Not the specific historical phenomenon of feudal heavy cavalry, but something deeper, the human capacity to face danger with courage, to serve causes beyond self-interest, to find meaning in sacrifice, to maintain honor even when pragmatism suggests otherwise. The knight rides forward through history, changing mounts, changing missions, but carrying still some essence of that original ideal. From Frankish cavalry at Tours to Navy SEALs in distant operations, the line stretches unbroken. The forms change, the technologies evolve, the tactics adapt, but the spirit, courage, service, honor, sacrifice persists. This is the knight's ultimate gift to history. Not a military system, those come and go. Not political structures, those transform constantly. But a model of what warriors can aspire to be. Not merely killers or tools of power, but individuals bound by codes larger than themselves, motivated by ideals that transcend immediate self-interest, willing to sacrifice for causes they deem worthy. The age of the armored knight has long passed. But the age of the warrior idealist continues. It continues because humans need such ideals. We need frameworks that make courage meaningful, that elevate service above selfishness, that affirm life's highest values, even especially when facing death. The knight taught us this. 6 centuries of European history, shaped by men on horses wearing metal, left this legacy. Not merely castles and crusades, not merely feudalism and tournaments, but an idea that how we face danger, how we serve others, how we maintain honor in dishonorable circumstances, these things matter profoundly. They matter more than survival itself. They matter because they make us fully human. This is what endures when all else fades. This is what the knight bequeaths to every generation that follows. Not tactics or traditions, but inspiration. The example of individuals who chose meaning over survival, who served causes greater than themselves, who faced the darkness with courage and died, when dying came, with their honor intact. The night is gone, but the knightly ideal rides on, carried forward by every generation that values courage over comfort, service over selfishness, honor over advantage. It rides on because we need it, because without such ideals we diminish. Because the human spirit requires more than mere survival, it requires meaning, purpose, and the opportunity to prove oneself worthy of the lives we lead. This is the knight's tale, from chaos to order, from innovation to obsolescence, from dominance to decline, but also from mortality to immortality, from historical phenomenon to eternal ideal, from flesh and steel to symbol and inspiration. The charge continues, the quest endures, the knight rides on,